Hello, I'm Dan Lewis. I am a retired professor from William Tyndale College in the state of Michigan in the United States. I'm also a retired pastor, and I have for most of my career been a member of the Society of Biblical Literature, which is the International Society of Biblical Scholars. My specialty is biblical studies. And I am your lecturer for the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. So we've called this series of lectures the road home. Everybody likes to go home at some point, but this was such an important idea for the Jewish people who were exiled into the land of Babylonia in 586 or 587 BC. So the books of Ezra and Nehemiah are the books in the Old Testament that describe the journey back from Babylon to Jerusalem to rebuild. To really understand the coming home, I think we need to understand the exile itself. And so I'm going to spend just a few minutes talking about the exile and what it meant. First of all, it meant the loss of the temple and the loss of the land for the people of Israel. This was such a critical juncture for them in their history because for many of them, they did not actually believe they could lose the temple, since it was where Yahweh was supposed to live and His presence was supposed to dwell forever. The land also was a promise given to them in which they were brought into the land in the time of Joshua and believed that they would be in that land basically without any stop, sort of in perpetuity. And now, with the exile into Babylon, they had to rethink a lot of things about the temple and about the land. Probably the single most important thing that they had to understand was that the exile was in fact an indication of God's faithfulness to His covenant promises. Now, those covenant promises included both blessing as well as cursing, blessing for obedience, cursing for disobedience. And this kind of idea really stems from the book of Deuteronomy in the Torah. The book of Deuteronomy is set up as a book that reflects a suzerain vassal treaty in the ancient Near East, in which the great king would have a treaty with a smaller nation, and in this case, the great king would be Yahweh, rather than some other nation of the ancient Near East. And attached to suzerain vassal treaties were blessings and curses. We find this in other extant treaties that we know from the period. For instance, the vassal treaties of Esarhaddon from Assyria include blessings and curses. For the people of Israel, the book of Deuteronomy has a whole section in chapters 27 and 28 where the blessings and curses of the covenant are described. And the most disastrous result of disobedience to the covenant would eventually be the loss of the land, as is described in the book of Deuteronomy. So when the prophets then begin to talk about the idea that Israel would go into exile, they did it largely in terms of the theology of Deuteronomy. In Jeremiah 25, for instance, you find this passage, Yahweh has sent you all His servants, the prophets, again and again, but you have not listened. They said, turn now each of you from your evil ways and your evil practices, and you can stay in the land. Yahweh gave you and your fathers forever and ever. But, Jeremiah says, you did not listen. In another passage, Jeremiah actually stood at the entrance to the temple. And as people came into the temple to worship, Jeremiah preached to them. And one of the things that he said was this is in chapter 7 of Jeremiah. If you really change your ways, then I will let you live in this place, in the land I gave your fathers forever and ever. But look, you are trusting in deceptive words that are worthless. There was actually a false prophet in the time of Jeremiah that predicted that the exile of the people, because some had already been taken into deportation, that it would only last a couple of years, and then it would all be over, they'd all come home, and everything would be fine. Jeremiah said, that's not going to happen. The exile is going to last for 70 years. Ezekiel also faced this same entrenched optimism, sort of a false optimism. And he also said that this optimism was very badly misplaced. So, in the end, Judah did go into exile. It started gradually. The policy of the Assyrians had been to sort of gradually move westward, sort of gobbling up countries as they came. First of all, establishing some kind of suzerainty, vassal relationship with a Western nation, and then if they did not conform to the covenant, to eventually just take them over. And this began, and this is the way the northern nation of Israel eventually went into exile to Assyria. But for Judah, this particularly happened in the changeover between Assyria and Babylon. In the time of Josiah, the Assyrian Empire was kind of waning at that point, and the Babylonians were taking over what was left of the Assyrian Empire. And at the time, the king of Judah was Jehoiakim, who was looking to Egypt as his primary sort of superpower that he felt would support him. But when Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon put Jerusalem to siege, Jehoiakim was forced to change his loyalty to the Babylonians from the Egyptians. At that time, Jehoiakim sent a number of his young men to Babylon to be schooled in Babylonian thought, including Daniel and the three young men. Then, somewhat later, Jehoiakim discovered that it looked like the winds of change were happening, at least that's the way he perceived it, and that Egypt was now rising in power. He thought maybe sufficiently enough that he could rebel against his Babylonian overlord. And so he tried that. Well, in a vassal suzerainty treaty, when you rebel against a suzerain, you pretty much know what's going to happen. They're going to show up with their army and they're going to bring you to heel. So this is what happened. Nebuchadnezzar comes again to Jerusalem. At this time, Jehoiakim tries to withstand the siege and is unable to. Jehoiakim is going to be killed. His son, who was only 18 years old, is going to come to the throne of Judah in Jerusalem, and he's only going to last 3 months until the Babylonians breach the wall of Jerusalem. They come in, they tear down the city, they burn the temple to the ground, and they deport masses of people. More than 10,000 people out of the city of Jerusalem were deported eastward 1,000 miles, more or less, to Babylon. Among those that were deported was a young priest by the name of Ezekiel. So he's famous, of course, because of the book that bears his name. But there was this first deportation of people to Jerusalem. And in place of Jehoiakim, Nebuchadnezzar set up a puppet king. This would be a vassal king under his authority by the name of Zedekiah. And Zedekiah would rule for about nearly a dozen years in Jerusalem before he also would be deported in what is called the second deportation. Well, the second deportation is the one that resulted in the real destruction of Jerusalem when the wall is breached and the temple is destroyed. There's even a further deportation a bit later that's mentioned at the end of the book of Jeremiah. But usually scholars speak of the first and the second deportation as the major deportations of people from Judah and Jerusalem over eastward into Babylon. The first one with Jehoiakim and his family, and then the second one after the fall of the city and the burning of the temple. In reflection upon this historical disaster, in Psalm 74 there is a very powerful description of what happened. And this is what it says. It says, "Pick your way through these everlasting ruins. All this destruction the enemy has brought on the sanctuary. Your foes roared in the place where you met with us. They set up standards as signs. They behaved like men wielding axes and hatchets. They burned your sanctuary to the ground. They defile the dwelling place of your name." This is such a vivid description of the destructive force of the Babylonian army, where the soldiers attacked the temple with axes and hatchets, and they set up their own standards, which would probably be emblems of their gods, And they basically claim that our God is bigger than your God, and we are now burning your temple to the ground. The little book of Lamentations, which is a series of poems, also describes this in very much the order of funeral songs. And it begins with this very wrenching description. How deserted lies the city, once so full of people. How like a widow she is, who once was great among the nations. She who was queen among the provinces has now become a slave. In the exile, the people of Judah lost their major defining symbols. They lost the land, which had been promised on oath to Abraham's descendants. They lost the temple on Mount Zion, which was believed to be Yahweh's dwelling place forever. They lost the Davidic king, whose dynasty of kings was supposed to last forever and would never end. In losing these kinds of things, then, the primary question that they have to address is how can the people of Israel maintain a distinct entity, or be a distinct entity, without these defining symbols? They don't have the land, they don't have the temple, they don't have the Davidic king. So how can they be themselves without these symbols? This, of course, is the task that the prophets call them to, that they must understand these areas of land, temple, and kingship in different ways than simply the political structure of the ancient Near East. One thing the prophets do say, though, that beyond exile, there is hope. One of the great things about the biblical prophets is that while they do predict a lot of disaster, a lot of judgment, a lot of disasters in history, yet the prophets always hold out beyond that disaster. There is still hope. There is hope beyond exile. And the prophets said this about Judah as well. In fact, beginning back in the 8th century, when the prophets first begin to talk about exile, they also begin to talk about the fact that there will be a remnant that will survive. Well, anybody that's ever been connected with someone who sews or works with cloth or fabrics knows what a remnant is. A remnant's a piece that's left over. And essentially, the term remnant in the Bible functions kind of in that same way. There's a piece that's left over. A piece that will go into Babylon as exiles, but still survive as the people of Judah. So one of the earliest of the 8th century prophets, which is Amos, has this word: I will bring back my exiled people. I will plant Israel in their own land and never again to be uprooted from the land. So there's this hope that somewhere on the other side of exile, there is a future that is good. Hosea, who is partly contemporaneous with Amos, says somewhat the same thing. He says the Israelites will live many days without king or prince, but afterward they will return, and I will plant her for myself in the land. The prophets in the south, which the two major ones would be Micah and Isaiah, and they also are roughly contemporaneous with Amos and Hosea, say much the same thing. Micah says, I surely will gather all of you, the remnant of Israel. In that day, declares Yahweh, I will assemble the exiles. Yahweh will rule over them in Mount Zion from that day and forever. In that day, Yahweh Tsabaoth will be a glorious crown for the remnant of his people. And in that day, Adonai will reach out his hand a second time to reclaim the remnant. He will assemble the scattered people of Judah from the four quarters of the earth. You can see that in these passages, the idea of remnant is a very significant word because it talks about this partial leftover piece of the people of Judah that would survive into the future and to whom there would be great promises of hope on the other side. As you move forward then into a later history in the 6th and the 7th century prophets, you find the same thing in voices like Zephaniah and Jeremiah. In the book of Zephaniah, the Lord says, I will gather those who have been scattered. At that time I will gather you, and at that time I will bring you home. Jeremiah says, I myself will gather the remnant of my flock out of all the countries where I have driven them. I will forgive the remnant I spare. When 70 years are completed, I will bring you back to the place from which I carried you into exile. I'll gather you from the nations where you've been scattered, and I will give you back the land of Israel again. And finally, when you get to the book of Daniel in chapter 9, Daniel says, in the first year of Darius, I, Daniel, understood from the scriptures that the desolation of Jerusalem would last 70 years. Now it's apparent that when Daniel says that, he is familiar with the oracles of Jeremiah, because it is Jeremiah who says that the exile will last for 70 years. So out of this hope for the future then, there is a series of proclamations of good news on the other side of exile. Zion will be redeemed with justice, Isaiah says. You who bring the gospel to Zion, you who bring the gospel to Jerusalem, lift up your voice with a shout and say to the towns of Judah, here is your God. The redeemed of the Lord will return, and they will enter Zion with singing. I looked and I saw the glory of the Lord filling the temple. These are the words of Ezekiel. Ezekiel is the prophet who first predicted that the glory of God would abandon the temple before its destruction. And now, near the end of his book, he says, I looked and I saw the glory of the Lord filling the temple once again. So these kinds of precious promises, these visions of the future on the other side of exile were very, very critical for this group of people who was transported from Jerusalem to Babylon. So in that context then, we need to make another major political shift. Just as Assyria gave way to Babylon, now Babylon is going to give way to Persia. In fact, the Babylonian Empire did not last very long, certainly not compared to the Assyrian. The Assyrian Empire lasted about 3.5 centuries. The Babylonians, considerably less than 100 years. And then the Persians would become the next great empire in the ancient Near East. There were a series of rulers in Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar, of course, is probably the most famous one, at least in the Bible. He gets a lot of press in the Bible. Following him, there was a ruler by the name of Nerglasser, and then Nabonidus, which is the ruler of Babylon at the same time that his son Belshazzar was regent with him. And it's that particular period of time that I want to talk about just for a moment of time. Nabonidus, even though he was the emperor, he had a fascination for Arabia, and he spent roughly 10 years in Arabia campaigning, leaving his son Belshazzar as the regent over the city of Babylon. During that period of time, while Nabonidus is absent from the capital, the Persians have begun to mobilize in the east, and they have begun to gobble up pieces of the Babylonian Empire. In fact, all the way until they put the city of Babylon itself to siege. Nabonidus is going to try to return in time to marshal his remaining troops and people against the Persians, and is not going to get there in time. In fact, he's basically going to get there in time just to see the city fall. Belshazzar, of course, who is the regent over the city of Babylon, is going to stage a very weak defense, and the Persians are going to take over the city of Babylon very quickly under the leadership of a man by the name of Cyrus. This picture that you see, which is an artifact in the British Museum in London, is an artifact of Nabonidus, who is the king of Babylon. During this time, you'll see in the stela that he is holding a staff in his hand, which is a symbol of his rulership. And you'll also see in the upper right of this stela 3 symbols. One that looks like a crescent moon, which is the symbol for the god Sin. And then in the middle, there is what in the ancient Near East is referred to as a winged sun disk. The little round thing in the middle is the sun, and the wings are the rays of the sun. This represents the Babylonian god Shamash. And then there is what looks like a star, which is actually the symbol of Ishtar, which is the planet Venus, at least if you think of it in terms of the constellations. And these represent the deities of Babylon. Nabonidus is shown with an attitude of reverence toward the gods. So he is the one that is officially the emperor of Babylon at the time that the Persians come in. If we go back a century or more, we will find that people who read the Bible and came across the name Belshazzar were a little frustrated that they couldn't actually find him in history. Belshazzar was not really known outside of the Bible itself for quite a long time. But then, roughly a century or so ago, we began finding references to Belshazzar in text other than the Bible. This little cylinder, which is not very big, it's only about 4 inches long, and you will see that in the British Museum should you have a chance to visit that sometime. But on this little 4-inch cylinder, Cyrus of Persia describes Belshazzar and names him by name. He says a weakling has been installed as the ruler of this country. And so this is one of those texts that helps us to coordinate ancient history with biblical history. This next artifact, which is called the Nabonidus Chronicle, is a cuneiform text that actually describes the fall of the city of Babylon. It mentions that Nabonidus was arrested in Babylon when he returned from Arabia. Cyrus entered the city of Babylon. And in fact, the siege of Babylon apparently was so severe that many of the people were under such conditions of deprivation and in some cases starvation that when Cyrus entered the city, they just kind of welcomed him as a liberator because they had been under such distressing circumstances. So Cyrus now has become the new emperor, not of Babylon, but of Persia, which is now subsuming the Babylonian Empire. And this is going to set the stage for the Jews to come back home from Jerusalem, or from Babylon to Jerusalem. Now, it may seem like we've kind of taken a long route to get to the return of the Jews from Babylon to Jerusalem, but all of this history is very integral to that process. So Nabonidus comes back from Arabia. He's immediately arrested. Cyrus annexes Babylon. It now becomes part of the new Persian Empire. In fact, the date on which Babylon fell is one of the best attested dates in antiquity. We can actually coordinate with ancient calendars and our modern calendar, and scholars will tell us that this happened on October the 12th, 539 BC, that's pretty specific. You'll also find descriptions of this in the Greek historian Herodotus, who describes how Cyrus took the city. In fact, Herodotus will describe that Cyrus drained the major flow of the Euphrates River into side canals, and then he marched his soldiers in water that was basically up to the middle of their thigh, right under the water gates into the city of Babylon, and they basically took the city nearly without a fight, all in one evening. And after his conquest of Babylon, Cyrus now is going to reverse what the Assyrians and the Babylonians have been doing by deporting people. Assyria began this process of deporting large pieces of the population. This went all the way back to Tiglath-Pileser III, who was probably the first great people mover in which he deported large sections of people to different parts of the empire. But successive Assyrian empires did the same thing all the way down until the end of the Assyrian Empire. And of course now Nebuchadnezzar, who is the Babylonian emperor, he's done the same thing. He's moved all these people out of Jerusalem and Judah, and he's taken them all over to Babylon and settled them there. Cyrus is going to do this different. He's going to say, you know, this is kind of puts in a sort of shirt sleeve sort of language, but he sort of says to himself, if I let all these people go back home, they're going to like me. Nobody liked the Babylonian emperors. They don't really like the Assyrian emperors, but if I let them go home, they're probably going to like me. I don't know if that's if I would let that stand up in court, but that seems to be his mindset. In any case, he issued an edict shortly after the conquest of Babylon, in which he would allow all of the displaced people in the empire to go back to their homelands and to rebuild not only their cities, but also their temples. This is, I guess, what you could call a form of enlightened self-interest, but it was part of his efforts to make the Persian Empire cohesive. And so this edict actually turns out to be a direct fulfillment of Jeremiah's prophecies. that the people of Judah would be allowed to return to their homeland. Cyrus is actually directly mentioned in the book of Isaiah. In Isaiah, Cyrus is called the one that God will as his anointed one to allow the people of Judah to go back to their homeland. This is a bas-relief of a four-winged figure that guards the entrance to Cyrus' tomb. Interestingly enough, all these years later, which is 2,500 years later, roughly, we still actually have the tomb of Cyrus the Great. And this is the passage in Isaiah that names him. Thus says Yahweh, I am Yahweh, who says of Cyrus, he is my shepherd, and he will carry out my purpose. And who says of Jerusalem, it shall be rebuilt. And of the temple, your foundations will be laid. And this is the famous Cyrus cylinder, which resides in the British Museum in London. This cylinder talks about the edict of Cyrus and says, I returned to these sacred cities on the other side of the Tigris. And by the other side of the Tigris, that would mean to the west of the ancient land of Babylonia. I returned to these sacred cities, the sanctuaries which have been in ruins for a long time, the images that used to live therein, and established for them permanent sanctuaries. And I also gathered all their former inhabitants and returned them to their habitations. So when we read in the Bible that the people of Judah were allowed to go back from Babylon to Jerusalem to rebuild, we should understand that this is part of a much larger plan that was for many ancient peoples, not just the Jews, but all kinds of displaced peoples were allowed to go back and to rebuild in their former habitations. All right, now we're back with the change from Babylon to Persia. You can have a look here at this map of what is called the Achaemenid Empire, which is the Persian Empire. The map that I'm showing is this empire at its greatest boundaries, which is under the time of Darius III. So it extends eastward all the way to the Indus River, which is at the edge of India. It includes all of Mesopotamia. It includes all of Palestine. It includes Egypt. It includes all of what would be modern Turkey and all the way into Upper Greece, the area of Macedonia. All this was part of the Persian Empire. So it's a very large empire. In fact, if you look carefully and find Susa, which is almost in the center of this map, just below the center point of this map, you'll see a gray line that extends all the way to Sardis in Phrygia to the left of the map. And that gray line represents what is called the Royal Road. This was a road that the Persians built largely for military purposes to transport troops, but it is one of the longest roads in the ancient Near East, and it was built by the Persians, and it does remind you kind of the passage in Isaiah where it talks about, I will make a way in the wilderness for you to go, and I will give you a road to travel on. Maybe that was kind of an allusion to the royal road that the Persians built. Here are some beautiful bas-reliefs of Persian guards. These are made out of glazed brick. You'll find these in the Louvre in Paris in the ancient Near Eastern section, but if you ever wanted to know what a Persian looked like or a Persian soldier, you will see that there are these are Persians with spear and bow. So Persian soldiers, quite beautifully done, and the glazed brick has retained a lot of its color over the many centuries since the time of Cyrus. This is a set of winged lions, also from the city of Susa. Susa was one of the administrative capitals of the Persian Empire, and it's associated with some important characters in the Bible, not the least of which, of course, would be characters like Nehemiah and Esther. In the iconography of these winged lions, you'll see the same kind of iconography that you find in much Assyrian art, where there is the body of a powerful animal, wings, sometimes the face of a human, these all speaking of intelligence and power and authority. And then above, at the top, you see the winged sun disk. This would be the symbol of Shamash, the sun god. And so you can see that it looks a little bit like a bird, but the circle in the middle is really representative of the sun and the rays of the sun. Also in the Louvre in Paris, you'll see this bull capital. This would be at the very top of a very large column in the palace of Darius I in Susa. And then you can see where the wood beams fit just between the heads of the bull, and this would of course be the beams that would uphold the roof of this palace. This particular palace was a palace of 36 columns, and these pillars upon which the capital set were quite large. They were about 20 meters high. So this is a sizable kind of building. Then on the right side you see the tomb of Cyrus. This was rediscovered actually in the early 1950s. We didn't know where it was exactly for a long time. It's quite large. It stands 36 feet high. But one of the interesting things about it is that this tomb was actually seen and recorded in the writings of Plutarch way back in the Roman period. So this tomb has been with us a very, very long time. Now I want to say a little bit about the texts and the histories of which we're talking about, the biblical texts and the histories. There are two histories of ancient Israel in the Bible. And you need to be aware that these two, even though they cover much the same material, are unique each in their own way. The first one is what scholars call Deuteronomistic history. This is history that you find in the collection of the Hebrew Bible called the Prophets, and these are called the former prophets, and it comprises the books of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. Now, for English readers of the Bible, we're used to thinking of 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings. But actually, originally, those were one scroll apiece, just the scroll of Samuel and the scroll of Kings. So there are 4 scrolls in this Deuteronomistic history called Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. And it takes the history of Israel from the conquest in the time of Joshua through the tribal league in the book of Judges, eventually through the united monarchy with the kingships of Saul, David, and Solomon. Then at the death of Solomon, the kingdom split into the northern nation and the southern nation. Eventually the northern nation goes into exile to Assyria, and finally the southern nation goes into exile in Babylon. And that comprises the history that reflects to a large degree the theology of Deuteronomy. I mentioned that earlier, that the blessings and curses of Deuteronomy are very much at the forefront of this history. And so these books show how disobedience to the covenant eventually resulted in the exile of the people of Israel and Judah. Then there's a second history, sometimes called the chronicler's history. This history is probably later than the Deuteronomistic history. In fact, there are portions of the chronicler's history that is taken from the books of Samuel and Kings, some of it actually almost word for word. The Chronicles history is a little different, though, in that it only really covers the southern nation of the people of Israel, the country of Judah. It starts with genealogies going all the way back to the Genesis genealogies of Adam and his descendants, but it really climaxes fairly early in the book with the reigns of David and Solomon. Then after Solomon's death and the country divided into the northern and the southern nation, this history will follow the southern nation only. It will say virtually nothing about the northern nation. In fact, if we did not have the books of 1st and 2nd Kings, we might know almost nothing about what happened in the northern nation. We wouldn't have the stories of Elijah and Elisha, those kinds of things, because this other history, the chronicler's history, really focuses only upon the southern nation of Judah. But it is the history that takes us to the exile itself, and then beyond the exile, it is the history that brings the Jews back to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. Most scholars agree that Chronicles, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, and Ezra and Nehemiah were compiled by the same either person or persons in the post-exilic period. And so it brings together a lot of these traditions from the earlier period into a single history that climaxes with the rebuilding of Jerusalem and the rebuilding of the temple. Here, as I've listed the collections in the Hebrew Bible, you can see how these two histories fall. The Hebrew Bible is divided into 3 major collections: the Torah, the prophets called the Nevi'im, and the Ketubim, or the writings. It's in the middle section that you have the first of those histories, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, which are called the former prophets. And it's in the third collection, the Ketubim, that you have the second history right at the end, Ezra, Nehemiah, and the books of Chronicles. We also need to talk a little bit about language, because once we get into the book of Ezra, Nehemiah, we're going to discover that this work is going to come to us in a couple of languages. First of all, most of it is going to be in the language of Hebrew, which is what most of the Old Testament is in. In fact, all except some relatively small portions are going to be in Hebrew in the Hebrew Bible. This is the language of ancient Israel. However, in 2 books of the Bible, and Ezra one of them, we're going to run into a second language. It's the language of Aramaic. Aramaic became the international language of the ancient Near East. And even though the people of Judah who went to Babylon in exile spoke Hebrew, in a relatively short time, they began to also speak Aramaic. In fact, as we will find later, when they came from Babylon back to Jerusalem, some of the younger people no longer could actually understand Hebrew very well. Aramaic had now become their major language. And so there are some sections in the book of Ezra, and you'll see them listed here in chapter 4 through 6, and also a portion of chapter 7, that are in a second language, which is called Aramaic. Aramaic and Hebrew are related to each other in that they use the same alphabet, but they are 2 distinct languages. So I suppose it would be somewhat analogous to, say, the difference between Italian and Spanish. They use the same alphabet, they're both Romance languages. They have a lot of common words, but they still are distinct languages. The Aramaic sections in the book of Ezra largely are official correspondences that are between provincial officials in the Trans-Euphrates province and the Persian government back further to the east. And so one of the reasons these are preserved in Aramaic in the book of Ezra is because they actually reflect texts that were written by government officials within the Persian Empire. And so Aramaic has become the official language of diplomacy and government function. Another thing we need to talk about is that there are 2 canons that continue to exist from the Old Testament, and that directly relates to the history that we find in the book of Ezra. Going back quite a long ways into the period of the Old Testament before the time of Jesus, there was a translation of the Hebrew Bible into Greek, which is called the Septuagint. And this is roughly 200 to 250 BC. And in this translation, there were included a number of books in Greek that were not in the Hebrew Bible. These are books that Protestants tend to call the Apocrypha, and Roman Catholics tend to call the Deuterocanonical books. This section includes 2 very important works called 1st and 2nd Esdras. Now, 1st and 2nd Esdras is a different version of the same kind of history that you find in the book of Ezra and Nehemiah. And that's why it's important for these lectures to recognize that this other source exists from the Jewish period. Protestants, of course, have not accepted the Apocrypha as canonical. From the time of Luther and forward, Protestants have made a definite decision that the apocryphal books are not canonical, and of course the obverse side of that is that the Roman Catholic Church at the Council of Trent decided yes, they are to be included in Scripture. So you kind of have these 2 streams of canonical ideas that come down. So basically Roman Catholics and the Eastern Orthodox Church accepts the Apocrypha as part of their scriptures. Protestants and Jews do not accept the Apocrypha as part of their scriptures, even though they may consider those books to be historically important. And they were important. They offer to us a viewpoint of the Jews during the intertestamental period. They offer to us some really important history that we would probably not have otherwise in the intertestamental period. So even though, if whoever is listening, if you happen to be Protestant, I would encourage you not to just simply dismiss these books as though they were unimportant. They in fact are quite important. and particularly with the study of the book of Ezra, there's going to be some interaction between those books. So here is a kind of a chart to show you how it works, and not to put it too bluntly, but this is a little bit complicated. First of all, the Masoretic text, which is the Hebrew text of the Old Testament, has basically one scroll, Ezra, Nehemiah. That's the one that's in Hebrew. And so if that's in Hebrew, then you wonder, well, okay, in English, we have Ezra, we have Nehemiah, and then in the Apocrypha, we have 1st and 2nd Esdras. How does that happen? Well, 1st and 2nd Esdras is written later than the books of the Hebrew Bible. And so when the Septuagint was translated from Hebrew into Greek, the Septuagint included a work called Esdras B, which is what we call Ezra and Nehemiah. And then they also had a work called Esdras A, which is what we call 1st Esdras in the Apocrypha. And the Septuagint did not have 2nd Esdras. To make things more complicated, I'm sure you don't want it more complicated, but there's no way to get around it. It is more complicated. When Jerome translated the Bible into Latin, and this is the Bible that was the basic Bible of the church for roughly 1,000 years. This is called the Latin Vulgate. When he translated the Bible into Latin, he had 4 books that were called 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Esdras. Now, this is the part that is easy to be confused. What he called 1st Esdras in the Latin Vulgate is really the book of Ezra that is in a typical English Bible. What he called 2nd Esdras is what we typically would call the book of Nehemiah. What he called 3rd Esdras is what in our English Bibles that have an Apocrypha is called 1st Esdras. So that's where it gets really confusing, because 3rd Esdras is really 1st Esdras. And what he called 4th Esdras is what we call 2nd Esdras in the English Bible. So if you survive that little discussion, good for you. I know it's complicated, but this is at least the way it has come down to us historically. And complications aside, at least we need to recognize the form that these books took. Another question that comes up is if the book of Ezra and Nehemiah were originally a single scroll, and of course you have to remember that as a scroll, it's rolled up on a spindle. It's not like in a codex in a book. So if the ancient text of Ezra and Nehemiah is one scroll on a spindle, how did they get separated into 2 books? Well, they were together in the Septuagint as one book called Esdras B. They were divided actually by Christians. And this goes back to the time of Origen in the 3rd century. Early 3rd century, Origen, one of the early church scholars and leaders, decided that Ezra and Nehemiah should be in 2 books, and so he divided them. And then, following that, in Jerome's Latin Vulgate, they were continued to be divided, and they were titled, as we mentioned in the previous slide, 1st and 2nd Esdras. Ironically, they weren't divided by the Jews until the 15th century AD. So the Jews kept them as a single scroll for many hundreds of years after Christians had begun dividing them, even though the Jews' opinion of the rabbis had long been that they were probably composed by different authors. So even though they were in a single scroll, even the Jewish rabbis generally recognized that probably Ezra was a different author than the book of Nehemiah. At least that's what is expressed in the Talmud. But in any case, though the issue is still debated, just about everybody agrees that it's not very likely that these 2 books were originally composed by a single author. But probably at least 2 authors are here, and we have continued to remain with them divided into 2 books, the book of Ezra and the book of Nehemiah. But at least that will explain why in this lecture I have hyphenated them and called this Ezra-Nehemiah. Because we're basically working with these 2 works that are originally in a single scroll. All right, we've got one more sticky, critical question that scholars worry about, and it's the chronology of these books. In fact, this is one of the more controversial issues about the Ezra-Nehemiah records. And it has to do with how do we organize the material. If you just read the story straight through, a straightforward reading suggests that Ezra came first, Nehemiah came second. However, there is at least a somewhat of a nagging question that arises with this, because if you look carefully at the stories, you'll discover that the reforms that Ezra instituted were very similar to the same kind of reforms that Nehemiah tried to institute. And so if Ezra's reforms were earlier and Nehemiah had to do them again, kind of sounds like Ezra's reforms were not very successful. Given that Judaism itself is so deeply tied to the figure of Ezra, in fact, Ezra is uniformly credited as being the father of Judaism, with Nehemiah coming later, that raised the question for many scholars, is that chronology correct? Another thing that exacerbates this question is this rather lengthy gap between the time of Ezra's arrival and his reading of the Torah. In the way that the books appear as they are now, Ezra arrives in Ezra chapter 7. But he doesn't actually begin reading the Torah publicly until Nehemiah chapter 2, which is 13 years later. That's a long time. Why would Ezra wait so long to begin his teaching office from the Torah? So because of these kind of nagging questions, a number of university scholars have suggested that Nehemiah may actually have come first. And while he attempted a number of kinds of reforms, which were quite important, those reforms were not completed until the coming of Ezra with the Torah. And so basically what they're doing is they're going to rearrange the chronology of the events in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah to a little bit different arrangement than you would typically find in the Bible. So we'll look at them side by side here. Here's the traditional chronology. It must be conceded that there is no textual evidence that any portions of the books were dislocated. Now, there are books in the Bible where we find some possible indications of dislocation, particularly the book of Jeremiah. I'm not sure how much you know about the chronology of Jeremiah, but if you look at the Septuagint, for instance, the order of things in the Septuagint is significantly different than the order of things in the Hebrew Bible and the Masoretic text. But we don't have that kind of thing going on with Ezra and Nehemiah. Furthermore, there's certain dates in the time of Nehemiah that seem pretty solid because they can be correlated with some other papyri which come from the ancient world, particularly papyri that mention Sanballat as a contemporary of Artaxerxes I. And so that kind of nails down some dates for Nehemiah. The public reading of the Torah, according to the traditional chronology, granted it was 13 years after Ezra arrived, but they would interpret this as being the climax of Ezra's reform, not the beginning of his work. So rather than seeing the public reading of the Torah as starting his reform, they see it as sort of capping his reform near the end of his ministry. On the other hand, if you go to the historical critical chronology, which you find in the university approaches, this is reconstructed then. So it's reconstructed with Nehemiah coming first and generally putting his career in between Ezra chapter 6 and chapter 7. So in this chronology, you have Ezra chapters 1 through 6, then you have the book of Nehemiah, then you have Ezra chapter 7 through the end. So in that way, Nehemiah comes early. His reforms are important, but they're not entirely successful. But when Ezra arrives with the Torah and the reading of the Torah, then the reforms are in fact successful. One major problem, however, with the historical critical chronology. If that chronology is correct, then the dates that are given in Ezra chapter 7 and Nehemiah chapter 1:1, those dates have to be changed. They would be incorrect as they stand. So that sort of leaves you with these two really big options for understanding the chronology of the book. One, the traditional chronology, just read Ezra straight through, Nehemiah straight through, that's the order. The other, you rearrange the order, sticking Nehemiah in the middle of the book of Ezra. Without trying to get any further into this discussion, I'll just simply say that in these lectures, I'm going to follow the traditional chronology. That is not to say that there are not points that are valid points in the historical critical chronology, but simply that as in my reading of the material, I am comfortable with the traditional chronology, and I don't think it is necessary to sandwich the book of Nehemiah into the middle of the book of Ezra. So we will approach it from that standpoint. Now, let's talk a little bit about the author, the purpose, and the structure of these books. Jewish tradition, particularly from the Talmud, holds that Ezra composed the book by his name and Nehemiah composed the book by his name. That's a long-standing tradition. Certainly both books contain material written in the first person. So in the book of Ezra, in chapter 7 and up through part of chapter 9, there are references to I, Ezra, this kind of idea. And in the book of Nehemiah, there are references to I, Nehemiah, first person singular. So certainly there seem to be some portions of the book that originally existed written by the people whose names are attached to them. Considerable portions are also composed in the third person. In fact, much larger portions than in the first person. So when things are written in the third person, where you're using words like he and him rather than I and me, that tends to suggest that there is another hand involved in the composition of these books, some kind of a compiler. This is the person that typically we call the chronicler, the person who compiled the material in 1st and 2nd Chronicles and Ezra and Nehemiah. So many scholars suggest that this compiler not only compile the records in Ezra and Nehemiah, but also compile the records of the kings of Judah, going all the way back to the time of David and Solomon, and then the division of the kingdom and forward. So that's about all we know. We can't say too much more than that at this point. We do know, however, that the Ezra and Nehemiah books complete the history that has begun in 1st and 2nd Chronicles. The end of the book of 2nd Chronicles references directly the decree of Cyrus that would allow the people to come back from Babylon to Jerusalem. And the opening verses of the book of Ezra cite the same thing. So the ending of 2nd Chronicles and the beginning of the book of Ezra are very, very similar. They detail the return of the exiles to Jerusalem. They narrate that they're going to come and build their temple. They're going to renew the covenant that they had in the time of Moses. All of those kinds of things. Eventually in the book of Nehemiah, they'll even reconstruct the city of Jerusalem and the walls and so on. So in particular, the Ezra and Nehemiah books are going to describe the restoration of the nation after the exile. One really important point here. At this point, the national center no longer is the monarchy, because the kingship of David will not be reestablished. Rather, the national center is now going to be the temple and the Torah. This becomes the center of the nation. So there is no longer a kingship. Even though they're going to come back from Babylon to Jerusalem, they are still going to be under the Persian Empire. So here's just a very brief listing of the structure of the book of Ezra. You can see as you look there, it includes the return of the exiles, the restoration of the second temple, the coming of Ezra, and then the book of Nehemiah, which describes the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem, also the final reforms of Nehemiah, and then his memoirs at the end. All right, now we want to talk about the significance of the temple. If Cyrus the Persian has now issued an empire-wide edict that displaced peoples can go from wherever they're dislocated back to their homelands and can rebuild their temples. And the Jews, of course, are going to take advantage of this because they're going to come back from Babylon to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple. Then it's important for us to understand the significance of the temple for the people of Judah. So that's what we want to talk about now. The idea of a shrine or a place in which Yahweh's glory could be displayed, goes all the way back to the books of the Torah, into the book of Exodus, when Moses was commanded to build a tent or a tabernacle as a dwelling place for the Lord in the midst of Israel. Actually, I think you should think of the ancient tabernacle as kind of a movable Mount Sinai. Mount Sinai, of course, is where God appeared at the top of the mountain to Moses. He gave the Ten Commandments, he gave the law, and so on. But what you kind of have in the tabernacle is sort of capsulizing that event, but putting it within the tent of meeting in a way that it can be moved. So you have the most holy place, which contains the Ark of the Covenant, and over the Ark of the Covenant is the glory of God. And you're going to find this described in different kinds of places, but in addition to Exodus, I've mentioned some passages in Psalm 68 that you may want to have a look at, because those are really important as they describe God in the tabernacle. Now, the future promise that is given particularly in Deuteronomy is that there will someday be a permanent shrine for the Lord, a permanent structure. A tabernacle, by very definition, is movable. A tent is movable, and it's designed to be movable. But there would come a time when, as it's described in Deuteronomy 12, that God will choose a place in the land of Canaan after the Israelites have arrived there, and there they will be able to erect a permanent structure where all the time the people will come to the same place. No longer will it be movable like the tabernacle is here, and then it's there, and then it's someplace else. There will be one single place, and that place that God would choose would be where a permanent structure would be built. Well, this doesn't actually happen until the time of David and Solomon. Up until the time of David, all the way through the period of the Judges and into the lifetime of Samuel, the tabernacle is still the tent, the movable tent that was built in the time of Moses. Of course, in the time of Samuel, there is this one really disastrous event in which the Ark of the Covenant and the tabernacle are separated. The Ark was taken into battle by the sons of Eli, and it was lost to the Philistines. And even though it was eventually recovered by the Israelites, it was never brought back to the tabernacle itself. And so eventually it is David that prepares a place for the ark in Jerusalem. He builds a temporary tent for it, but he has a plan that he wants to build a permanent sanctuary. And that is a signal that the Israelites have now completed the conquest of Canaan. According to Deuteronomy, the place that God would choose for the permanent shrine would be done after the Israelites had achieved peace in the land of Canaan. And that doesn't happen during the lifetime of Joshua. It doesn't happen certainly during the period of the Judges or the lifetime of Samuel. But it is going to happen during the lifetime of David. David is the one who completes what Joshua started. And when David has completed the conquests of the Canaanites and the various outlying enemies of Israel, he has in his mind, in his heart, this idea that there should be the permanent shrine built just as the book of Deuteronomy says. This is actually a painting, but it's based upon archaeological findings as sort of what the city of Jerusalem probably looked like in the time of Solomon. You can see in this artist's conception that there is a depiction of the walls of Jerusalem, but in the top, slightly to the, almost to the left corner, the top left corner, you will see a structure which represents the temple that Solomon would build. This would be on the top of Mount Zion, this upper escarpment that had been purchased by David from a Jebusite. This is kind of what the first temple probably looked like. There are some questions about this. One question in particular is, how is the most holy place located within this larger structure? In this particular depiction, you'll see there's space at the top, between the top of the most holy place and the roof of the temple. You'll find other depictions in which the most holy place, the whole thing is raised up, so that it is kind of on two levels. You come into the main hall, and then you go up a set of steps into the most holy place. This is one of the questions that scholars fuss with and have not found consensus on. But the things that are clear is that this first temple was laid out very much similar to the tabernacle that was built by Moses. It has an inner room, which is the most sacred place that is cubic in shape. In this inner room, there will be the Ark of the Covenant. Then there is a covering between that and the outer room, or the main hall. The main hall is where there would be the seven-lamped candelabra, the table of the bread of the presence, the altar of incense. And then as you get to the actual threshold of the temple, there are the two pillars that were part of Solomon's temple that were never actually part of the tabernacle. So that's kind of an innovation on David's part. In fact, in the Chronicles record, it mentions that David says that God had put into his heart the plan for this tabernacle. So he actually believed that the architectural style of the temple had been inspired by God. We have virtually no remnants of this first temple. In fact, the only artifact that survives is this little ivory pomegranate scepter head. It's not very big. It's only about this large. It is in Israel, in the museum in Israel. And this little pomegranate, which is made out of ivory, is inscribed around just around below the neck of the pomegranate with an inscription that says, "Holy to the priests belonging to the house of Yahweh." Now, some of that has been reconstructed, as you can see by the brackets in the statement, belonging to the priests, or holy to the priests belonging to the, and it just says H, and then there's a bracket, house of Yahweh. That's really is because there is part of that inscription that is not legible. But we're pretty sure that's what it says. Now, this little scepter head is likely the only remaining thing out of the temple that Solomon built. And in fact, this one is even debated. There are some scholars that are unsure whether this is genuine or whether this might be a forgery. But at present, at least, and at the time that I'm doing this lecture, this is in May of 2016, there have been some significant scholars, some of the most important paleographers in the world, who have put themselves, committed themselves to the idea that this pomegranate is in fact authentic. They believe the writing is authentic, they believe the time is authentic, and so while there's still some debate surrounding it, at least there seemed to be a consensus kind of emerging that this is a genuine artifact and that it does actually go back to the first temple. When the people lost the temple, when the temple was destroyed by the Babylonians, they faced a huge theological crisis. Now, you might think that that shouldn't have been as big a crisis as it was, but it was a big crisis. If you go back to the time of Solomon, when Solomon is first building the temple, God speaks to Solomon in 2 Chronicles 7 in a very specific way, and it is a covenant statement. If you turn away and forsake the decrees and commands I've given you, then I will uproot Israel from my land. And though this temple is now so imposing, all who pass by will be appalled and say, "Why has the Lord done such a thing to this land and to this temple?" Well, that's a very solemn warning, and that solemn warning is repeated in varied ways by the prophets who come later. In fact, beginning with Micah, the prophets begin to talk about the fact that they would lose Jerusalem and they would lose the temple. Micah is the first who says this. In Micah chapter 3, and this is in the 8th century BC, Micah says that Zion will be plowed like a field. That means the Temple Mount will be plowed like a field. That means the temple's not there anymore. It's a way of saying that the temple will be destroyed. Isaiah is going to say the same thing. Huldah, the prophetess in Jerusalem during the time of Josiah, is going to say the same thing. Zephaniah is going to say the same thing. Jeremiah is going to say the same thing. And in particular, Ezekiel is going to say that God is going to abandon this temple so that it may be destroyed. Well, here's an interesting depiction. When you open the book of Ezekiel, excuse me, when you open the book of Ezekiel, you start right out with this really strange vision of the four creatures and the wheel intersecting the wheel, the wings of the creatures, the living creatures. And as you work your way through the early chapters of Ezekiel, Ezekiel says, the cherubim rose upward, the glory of the Lord departed from over the threshold of the temple. The glory of the Lord went up from within the city, stopped above the mountain east of it. And basically, what Ezekiel depicts is that the glory of God is leaving the temple, heading east. Of course, that means that it is heading east at the time the exiles are going east. So the glory of God is not tethered to the temple. The glory of God is connected with the remnant that is going to Babylon. This particular picture here, which is a watercolor by William Blake, I was actually disappointed. A couple of weeks ago, I was in Boston, and I was at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. I wanted to actually look at this painting closer. It's a watercolor, and after talking to the curator at the Boston Museum, was informed that they don't allow the watercolors except under very special conditions to be even viewed because of light tending to destroy the color vibrancy and so on. So I was disappointed. I didn't actually get to examine this in person a couple of weeks ago when I wanted to, but it is a really interesting depiction of what Ezekiel tries to describe in his first chapter. As Ezekiel preaches, this is what he says. In fact, the Lord speaks to Ezekiel and says, Son of man, record this date, this very date, because the king of Babylon has laid siege to Jerusalem on this very day. So Ezekiel records a particular date, even though Ezekiel already is in Babylon. He's already exiled. But back home in Judah, Babylonian armies have surrounded Jerusalem and they have put the city to siege. So God says, I have spoken. The time has come for me to act. I will not hold back. I will not have pity. I will not relent. You will be judged according to your conduct and your actions, declares the sovereign Lord. And so the word of the Lord came to me, and say to the house of Israel, this is what Adonai Yahweh says. I am about to desecrate my sanctuary, the stronghold in which you take pride. And eventually, the word would reach Ezekiel all the way in Babylon. As he says, in the 12th year of our exile, a man who had escaped from Jerusalem came to me and said, the city has fallen. Well, this creates a calendar of destruction. The siege of Jerusalem began on the 10th day of the 10th month. The city wall is breached about a year and a half later, in the 9th day of the 4th month, later in the reign of Zedekiah. Eventually, once the wall is breached, we're really at the beginning of the end. I mean, as long as you can keep those armies out on the outside of the wall, you've got a chance. But once the wall is breached, once there is an opening into the city, it won't be long. And so it really is barely a month before the Babylonians take over the entire city. They burn the temple to the ground. The Ark of the Covenant actually has disappeared at that point. We don't know what happened to it. And the city is destroyed. In fact, it's always interesting to speculate about what happened to the Ark of the Covenant. There is several theories about that, which I won't go into any depth. But one is that Jeremiah hid the ark in one of the caves down near the Dead Sea. That is an ancient Jewish tradition. There is another tradition that says the ark was taken to Mount Sinai. There is an Ethiopian tradition that the ark was moved to Ethiopia. In fact, there's a group that claims they still have it. They just won't let anybody see it. Of course, the ark was made quite famous in the movie by Indiana Jones, who claimed to have found it down in Ethiopia and eventually ends up in a warehouse and is lost. So that's obviously just total fiction. But when it comes right down to what happened to the Ark of the Covenant, the blunt truth is, we don't know. What we do know is it disappeared and it never came back. So after this calendar destruction, what you have is that each of the days of these tragedies became a day of fasting for the Jews. You'll find it mentioned in Jeremiah and 2 Kings, but you find it also mentioned in the book of Zechariah, that these days become days of mourning, days of grieving over the loss of Jerusalem. And in fact, That grief over the loss of Jerusalem, which was traditionally on the 7th of the month of Av, eventually is going to be collapsed into a day of mourning for the second temple that would be destroyed in the period of the New Testament by Titus Vespasian. Almost the same time, just a couple of days difference. And so the Jewish community, even today, will continue to mourn the loss of the temple on the 9th of Av, which is just a couple of days later than the 7th, about the first temple's destruction. And both of these are dates of mourning for the loss of the temple. Now, one of the predictions of Ezekiel is that after the exile, he doesn't say when after the exile, but sometime after the exile, he says that the glory of God that has left the temple is going to come back. And he ordains in this oracle that the new temple will be the place of my throne and the place for the soles of my feet. This is what God says. This is where I will live among the Israelites forever. Now, the temple that Ezekiel describes, and this is a reconstruction of it by scholar John Taylor, kind of shows you a floor plan of the new temple that Ezekiel describes. We won't go into a lot of detail there. It also shows the courtyard. You can see the courtyard, the outer court, the inner court, the actual sanctuary, the various pieces of the courtyard that Ezekiel envisions in the last 9 chapters of his book. Until finally you get to the last word of Ezekiel, which is a word that says the glory of God has come back to the temple. And the very final word of the book of Ezekiel is Yahweh Shammah, which means the Lord is there. He has come back to his temple. So that's the promise. So we have to believe that when these exiles in Babylon group themselves together for the return trip to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple, they are doing it with this whole idea in mind, that the glory of God that was once in the temple that Solomon built, if they will rebuild the temple, the glory of God will return to that temple, and he will once more be in the midst of the people of Israel. So the people who are going to return to Jerusalem under the leadership of a man by the name of Sheshbazzar will have done so with this vision in mind. They have in mind that they are part of this long-range purpose of God in which the glory of God is going to return to his people. Ezekiel predicts a new temple that will be faithful to the design that was given. And so Ezekiel, of course, well known among the exiles in Babylon, almost certainly then the people who returned with the permission of Cyrus believe that they have a spiritual mandate. They believe that this is the hand of God that is directing them to return with the permission of Cyrus to Jerusalem and to rebuild the temple. And so there will be a list of the returning party as it is described in the first chapter of Ezra. Everyone whose heart God had moved to go up and build the house of the Lord in Jerusalem. These are the people that are going to come back to Jerusalem and begin this process of rebuilding. So we'll suspend the lectures at this point, and in our next lecture we will actually begin with the first chapter of the book of Ezra.